Counterparts are a facet of Yugioh. You have a monster or something else, and then there's another card related to it in appearance and maybe even effect. Counterparts come in various forms. Look at your pallette swaps, retrains, dark counterparts, zombified versions, there's a lot. I've covered some in the past. However, just because two cards are related via counterpart doesn't mean they get equal treatment in the public eye. What about those cards that get so popular that you forget they had a counterpart and just thought they were standalone cards? I want to go over the counterpart cards that got left in the dust in terms of popularity. Usually it's from a lack of exposure or reprints in combination with the known counterpart being leagues better or more notable than the forgotten one, which may just be a level 3 monster with a poor stat line. And to help me build sympathy for these overlooked doppelgangers, I have my compassionate co-host, Judgment Meter.
I'm only here for the elves.
Mystical Elf and Dark Elf are not appearing on this list.
I'm out.
She's not actually leaving.
We'll just start losing views.
Now, let's cheer up the top 10 forgotten Yu-Gi-Oh card counterparts. Number 10, Nobleman of Extermination. This is a counterpart of Nobleman of Crossout, which was a good card back in the day. For Crossout, you can target a face-down monster, destroy it, then banish it. And if the monster banished was a flip effect monster, you banish all copies of that card in both decks. So it may be a double-edged sword if you and your opponent have that monster, but it's generally worth it. In early Yu-Gi-Oh, flip effect monsters were pretty strong, so this card stops those effects before your opponent can activate them. Even if it was not a flip monster, 1-for-1 removal was still very helpful, with cards like Smashing Ground being staples in 2002. Nobleman of Extermination was a counterpart used for back row. You target a face-down spell or trap, destroy then banish, and if it was a trap, you banish all cards with that name from both decks. The unfortunate thing for Extermination was it was a lot less useful than Crossout. While flip monsters could not be flipped in response to Crossout, back row could be flipped in response to Extermination depending on the card. Quick play spells like Mystical Space Typhoon or Book of Moon could be activated in response, and any traps could be flipped as long as they meet the activation requirements. And since Extermination specifies face down cards, when the card is flipped, it's no longer considered face down and Extermination's effect fizzles, so you don't even get the banish effect now. Though this card was good against battle traps like Mirror Force that couldn't respond, so it wasn't totally useless. However, cards like Mystical Space Typhoon destroyed back row on either turn, so Extermination was outclassed before it even arrived. Still, I've always liked Extermination. I think it's the card art. I like to imagine him angrily stabbing the card with his giant sword and almost his giant hands. Like he's gritting his teeth and has red eyes. He's very mad at your trap holes.
His fingers are like French toaster sticks.
Is that good or is that a criticism?
I mean, it's a compliment for me. I like French toaster sticks.
Alright, but I'm sorry though, you can't eat his fingers.
Not toaster sticks.
While both these noblemen are irrelevant now, Nobleman of Crossout got a notoriety boost in 2021 when he was turned into Crossout Designator. It's a quick play spell that can negate any effect if you banish a card with the same name from your deck, so it's good against staples that both you and your opponent would have in your deck, like Ash Blossom or Infinite Impermanence.
Is it just him in a fighting pose?
Basically, yes. He's designating the Crossout.
CrossFit trainer.
No, Crossout, like Nobleman of Crossout.
Noble CrossFit trainer. Level 5!
Oh, and after I wrote all that, I learned Crossout Designator is actually a counterpart to the trap Armageddon Designator, which has a similar effect, just in trap form, and you can only banish a card from your hand to negate, but it lasts for the rest of the duel. Also, it references Armageddon Knight as the monster on the art doing this, which confuses me more since why did they want a card that references Armageddon Knight to now reference Crossout? Either way, give us more Extermination guy. Number 9, Winged Dragon, Guardian of the Fortress, number 2. This card embodies two things early Yu-Gi-Oh really liked doing to make the card pool seem bigger and the monsters feel more related. The first thing was recoloring existing monsters and giving them a name different enough to pretend it's a new monster. Sometimes these monsters were related, like Beautiful Headhuntress being a fusion material for Warrior of Tradition, but most of the time it was just the first monster in a different pose and a different color.
What about the one that looks like Morgan and then the one that looks like Jolene?
You mean Vishwar Randi and Succubus Knight, two of the most well-respected Yu-Gi-Oh cards ever? Also, the color scheme's a bit off for Jolene since she's not usually orange.
I stand by what I said.
The second thing was exclusive to international releases. The translators would rename duos of monsters to have the same name but just adding 1 and 2 at the end of their names to make them related, while in Japanese, those monsters usually had completely different names. Once again, sometimes they were palette swaps, but a good amount of them usually just had the same typing, like how Darkfire Soldiers 1 and 2 were Fire Warriors in Japanese with nothing else in common. One duo of monsters that fit both these categories is Winged Dragon, Guardian of the Fortress number 1 and 2. The famous monster is of course number 1. It's an under-the-radar iconic monster. Like you're not going to remember this monster over something like a Blue Eyes White Dragon, but it had some notable, not quite in-your-face moments early on. It was the first monster Yugi summoned in his first anime duel against Kaiba, where it was able to dominate a bit until Kaiba boosted his clown. Then a lot of its appearances after that were as fodder to show how much stronger the opponent's strategy was for a part of the duel. But more importantly, Winged Dragon got its claim to fame for me from the theme song. In the original dub theme, when Yugi says, "It's time to da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da duel," Winged Dragon is the monster he throws down as he says it. Doesn't that stick out in anyone else's memory when they see this monster? It's also in the montage of monsters in that theme song, so with its semi-prominence in the anime and being a common card in real life, I was always bothered as a kid that it had this number 1 in its name and I could never find the number 2. Surely it has to be in these Metal Raiders packs somewhere, yet they never said the number 1 from its name in the anime as well. Maybe it was standalone. This alleged number 2 was my white whale for a while, until I just googled it one day and was like, neat, it's red. It's a pretty standard normal monster that's not worth playing, but it was so rare and I could never find it through normal means because it was only available in the first ever tournament pack, which are booster packs that you only get for going to official Yu-Gi-Oh tournaments. Since it was the first ever tournament pack and the competitive scene was likely very small at the time and it was never reprinted, this card probably was not circulated much since no one wanted it and it wasn't the easiest to find, but I at least eventually solved the mystery. I also just noticed it's a winged beast and not even a dragon. What were they doing with this guy? Number 2 was also a victim of being renamed to match its counterpart, where its Japanese name just translates to Wyvern. I think it's funny how generic and simple of a name it had, while the English name gives it all these extra words. Also, if Winged Dragon number 1 was the first monster Yugi summoned in the anime, that means it's the earliest anime monster not yet to have a retrain. So look out for Winged Dragon, Guardian of the Fortress number 3 on our next retrain wish list. Number 8, the Reliable Guardian. In the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh, we saw plenty of stat boosting cards. The bulk of them raised attack and defense by the same amount, like Horn of the Unicorn or Sword of Deep-Seated, but there was also those share of cards that just raised attack, like Malevolent Nuzzler or Reinforcements. But one attack booster from those days that remained relevant for longer was Rush Recklessly. It raised attack by 700 and was a quick play spell, so it was more useful than those other cards since you could activate it on your turn or your opponent's, and you could wait until the last second to activate it due to how stat changing quick effects work in Yu-Gi-Oh! The card also had some extra identity since there was a charging warthog on it and I think people just liked the design. He's a fun little guy running, what's not to love? This card was so iconic they gave it 2 upgrades, being Super Rush Recklessly and Super Rush Headlong, both of which forced the opponent's monster off the field in some way to go with the charging animal motif. He's headbutting them off the field. But amidst these newer counterparts was an old counterpart for Rush that people likely forgot about. The Reliable Guardian, released in the same set as Rush in 2002, and both released even earlier in Japan. He's Rush Recklessly, but for defense, and that's why he's not good. Defense boosting effects were rarely useful outside of long games with like Mystical Elf and Giant Soldier of Stone stalling out your opponent until you get a big beatstick tribute monster. There were a few cards that could take advantage of it, like Stone Statue of the Aztecs, but it wasn't until many years later when specific archetypes specialized in high defense. But the reason the Reliable Guardian exists is because all of those attack boosting cards from the early days had parallel cards that raised defense by the same amount. It's just funny without context though, saying that these 2 cards are related based on the art alone.
Yu-Gi-Oh cards are like how Digimon evolve. They don't make any sense. I don't get it. I don't like it.
They're not evolutions of each other, they're just related by effect. Reliable Guardian's just a guy.
Is that guy wearing a jacket? Because if he's not, that badge is just like stitched to his biceps.
You know, I always thought that was a bicep with weirdly shaped muscles, but now that you mention it, I think it's actually a puffy jacket sleeve with weird texture. If you want a good indicator of how badly the Guardian was left behind compared to Rush, Rush Recklessly was reprinted in new sets and structure decks many times for over a decade, since it was a good beginner card and had uses in limited formats, with its last reprint being in 2015, not counting the 25th anniversary re-release of Spell Ruler. The Reliable Guardian, though, its last reprint was 2004 in Dark Beginning 1. Not surprised, but you kinda feel bad for him. He was always so reliable, and he guarded us. Number 7, Dark Horus, the Dark Creator, and Dark Nephthys. I'm bundling these guys together since they all serve the same purpose, and they have the same level of forgettability to me. Each is based on the cover boss card of the last 3 sets before the GX era. Soul of the Duelist, which had Horus of the Black Flame level 8, Rise of Destiny, which had the Creator, and Flaming Eternity, which had Sacred Phoenix of Nephthys. All 3 were good, but a bit hard to get out to use their effects. Horus locked down all spell card activations, the Creator revives a monster once per turn, and Nephthys destroys all back row by reviving itself from the graveyard after it's destroyed by a card effect. These 3 cards eventually went different paths in life, but before any of them acquired new forms or archetypes, they got dark forms. The 2008 set, Phantom Darkness, was all about the dark. It was headlined with the original Yugioh cards, but we saw a small group of dark counterparts arrive in this set. This set had Dark Armed Dragon in it, so any dark counterparts pale in comparison. For Dark Armed Dragon, all you gotta do is have exactly 3 darks in the graveyard, and you can special summon him and then banish a dark in the graveyard to destroy a card on the field without a limit per turn. Crazy! It made people quit the game. But the other bosses, just underwhelming, and they have worse effects than their original forms. The Dark Creator needed at least 5 dark monsters in the graveyard to be special summoned, and once per turn, it could banish a dark to revive a dark. Dark Horus didn't have a special summoning method, so you just had to tribute for it or dump him in the graveyard to revive him another way. His effect is, once per turn during your opponent's main phase, when a spell card is activated, you can then special summon a dark monster from the graveyard. So basically a worse version of the Dark Creator's effect, unless you can really manipulate the spell card activations during your opponent's turn. And Dark Nephthys could be sent from the hand to the graveyard if you have at least 3 dark monsters in your graveyard and you banish 2. Then during your next standby phase, it could revive itself, not to pop all back row without targeting like its original form, which could potentially hit 6 cards on your opponent's side of the field, but rather to target 1 back row and pop it, which is a slow effect with little payoff. It was hard to get hype about these cards when Dark Armed Dragon was so much better than all of them and its own original form, so these dark forms quickly faded away, but there were greener pastures for these boss monsters. Horus spent years being irrelevant until 2023 created the Horus archetype, that played nothing like the original Horus, but it was an engine to dump cards into the graveyard, so people liked it. Nephthys got the most steady amount of updates over the years, where she got 2 new retrains, ritual support, a chaos form, and had cards that destroyed the original Phoenix in your hand or deck to immediately put its effect online. I actually played this deck in real life. It's really fun, but needs a bigger payoff. And for the Creator, well, he just got a chaos form that is better than the dark form, but he's still waiting for his own archetype at this point. Don't worry, you'll get one, buddy, I think. Horus had to wait almost 20 years for his, so your time will come soon, maybe. Number 6, Dark Mirror Force. Original Mirror Force is one of those classic cards that everyone seems to love. It's a battle trap that you activate in response to your opponent declaring an attack, and then you get to destroy all of your opponent's monsters in attack position. It could turn around a duel instantly. It was so good back in the day that it spent some time on the ban list, and when it was banned or limited, Konami tried giving us a different Mirror Force to satiate our Mirror Force needs. In 2004, they released Dark Mirror Force. They tried making it the inverse of Mirror Force to an extent, which ultimately led to no one using it. When an attack is declared, it banished all of your opponent's defense position monsters. The banishing part is kinda cool, but the fact that it goes after defense position monsters makes it less likely to hit more monsters. If your you're attacking to activate it, you're usually guaranteed at least one monster with the original Mirror Force, but relying on your opponent having monsters in defense position, maybe if they're trying to play around regular Mirror Force you'll hit something. A shame too, since Dark Mirror Force seemed so hype at the beginning, simply because it was the edgier looking Mirror Force. But what made Dark Mirror Force even more forgettable is Mirror Force got 5 more variations, all of which were better than Dark. Once Mirror Force got power crept with battle traps going out of vogue and more cards being able to clear it before battle, or just withstand it, it left the ban list, and Konami got more creative with things it could do to attacking monsters. The gimmick with the variations, though, tied Dark Mirror Force in by making the other 5 cards based on the remaining 5 attributes in the game, retconning that Dark Mirror Force was the first in the series representing the Dark attribute. In 2007, we got the Light variant, Radiant Mirror Force, which is worse than regular Mirror Force since it only works if your opponent has 3 or more attack position monsters, but I think Mirror Force was still limited at this point. Then in 2015, we got the Wind variant, Storming Mirror Force, which bounces the attack position monsters back to hand. And 2015 and 16 brought us the remaining Mirror Forces.
Oh, I didn't know that there were more of these.
Blazing Mirror Force.
Sure.
Drowning Mirror Force.
I can't with this.
And Quaking Mirror Force.
I don't know if we needed all of them.
But Judgment Meter, there's one more.
Oh no.
May I introduce to you Mirror Force Launcher?
Oh no. Too many balls.
All these were great. Blazing was for burn damage decks, drowning shuffled monsters back into the deck against direct attacks, and was a Duel Link staple for a while, and Quaking sets all attack position monsters in face-down defense position, and they can't be flipped face-up. Oh, and Mirror Force Launcher is a beefed-up searcher for Mirror Force. It's not really that good, but it was cool in the Vrains anime. With how great most of these Mirror Forces turned out, it's understandable that Dark Mirror Force got lost in the sea of better battle traps, and that doesn't even include Mirror Force Dragon and Mirage Mirror Force. If anything, we can credit Dark Mirror Force for holding down the fort before the better Mirror Forces arrived. Number 5. Familiar Possessed Lina, specifically the Familiar. The little buddy of Lina on this card is a counterpart of the early game vanilla monster, Happy Lover. This card was nowhere on my radar, but one of my co-hosts' favorite cards is Happy Lover, and she specifically requested this for the list, so I thought, why not? Happy Lover is kind of a notable card. It was Teia's companion in the Capsule Monsters anime, and she used it to beat Joey in episode 2 of the anime. Plus, Bakura used it for his Wicked Soul reading on Pegasus, and it made other cameos throughout the various series, so it's made its rounds in the anime.
Oh, the angel card! The angel card! It's Bakura's card! It's Bakura's card!
And Teia's.
It's good! It's Bakura's card! And it's so cute. What a cute little ping pong. What does this do? Is it just full of happy, nice things filled with love?
Its effect is, well, it doesn't have any. It's got that classic Yu-Gi-Oh flavor text that makes it sound more powerful than it actually is. Enemies become overjoyed when struck by the heart ray emitted from the forehead of this tiny cherub. Scary!
Oh, good. Things that I like that have nothing to do with the actual game. My kind of story. What does good Bakura's deck even do?
Good Bakura doesn't really have a deck. In Duel Links, they gave him a bunch of fiend monsters.
Nice Bakura, where are your cue cards? Why does he look like that?
In real life, it was in the second Japanese pack ever in 1999, with one reprint in 2010. For the Western release in the TCG, though, it was only released one time, nearly 10 years after it was released in Japan, appearing in the second Champion pack in 2007, which were packs you could only get by going to a tournament. Despite being a common card, the single release not in stores makes it pretty expensive for a useless normal monster. But what a lot of people forget or just don't think about is Happy Lover has an evolved form that exists but also doesn't exist. Enter the Charmers. The Charmers are a group of spellcasters with different forms, each specializing in one of the 6 attributes. They all have familiars that are actually monsters in the game with their corresponding attribute. Lina, the Light Charmer, has has our friend Happy Lover as her familiar. Furthermore, all 6 of them have familiar possessed forms, showing that their little buddies have evolved alongside them. The 4 elemental charmer familiars have their evolved forms as standalone cards that support them too, but the light and dark ones don't have individual monster cards, so this mature Happy Lover only exists as background art for now, which is why it's in this limbo of existing but also not existing.
Aw, they're a family now. That looks like a Digimon card.
So that opens up the obvious question, will it ever get its own card? Probably on a rainy day, but it's always been one of those cards that just has this aura of mysteriousness because it appears nowhere else. Why doesn't it look as happy? Is it scarred by the trauma of battle, or did it finally realize being happy all the time isn't healthy for its emotions? The main reason it probably hasn't been printed yet is the light and dark charmers came out much later than the elemental charmers, so they're lagging behind. The original familiar possessed charmers came out in 2005, while Lina's familiar possessed form came out in 2017. However, Ranryu, who's the Wind Charmer's evolved familiar, didn't come out until 2019, and that's a 14-year gap from when it appeared on the familiar possessed card. With that timetable, we're looking at a release around, 2031 for the Happy Lover evolution. Sorry, bud, at least you have the Japan exclusive Tenderness as your counterpart still.
You did great! I lose.
I did it! I beat Yugi!
Number 4, the Attribute Knights. Armageddon Knight was made in 2008 as a standalone card.
He looks like Zangetsu from Bleach. Mysterious, long flowing black hair, sword wielder, kicks butt.
When it's summoned, you can send a dark monster from the deck to the graveyard. With how many monster effects activate when sent to or in the graveyard, it's still relevant to this day, even spending most of its life on the ban list in some form, usually being limited or semi-limited. However, starting in 2012, Konami released knights for the other attributes, usually 1 or 2 new ones per set during the Xyz era. They all had the same type of effect resolution, where they send a monster with their corresponding attribute from the deck to the graveyard, and all of them flopped because each one of them had a different requirement to activate their effect. None of them as simple as just activating when they're summoned. The most useful of the other 5 was probably Dawn Knights for the light attribute. It needs to be sent from the field to the graveyard to send a light monster to the graveyard, which is doable enough in the modern era with Link summoning. But the other knights, shaking my head. For wind, you have Altitude Knight, who sends a wind to the graveyard when another monster is sent from the field back to the hand or deck. I think this is a reference to Mist Valley, which is a wind archetype that likes to do that. I mean, it's a cool reference, but there are other wind archetypes that would have liked your consideration. I guess Harpy Ladies also do it. Next, we have Brushfire Knight, who sends a fire monster to the graveyard when it or another fire monster is destroyed and sent to the graveyard. This trigger is alright considering Fire Kings like to destroy their own monsters, but relying on your monsters being destroyed better mean you have cards that destroy it for you if you want any sort of consistency.
Really? I'm looking at his banging hips. Inappropriate? Inappropriate? I don't know.
No, it's fine.
Okay. He's very curvy. It's nice.
Then there's Dust Knight for Earth, and it's a flip effect in 2012. Sorry, buddy. I don't know why Konami was still giving monsters random flip effects when they weren't in a flip-centric archetype at this point. Maybe they were preparing for crawlers, or Subterror. And finally, there's Shore Knight, who sure is a knight. He sends a water monster when his battle position is changed, and only when face up, so no flipping. I don't know, maybe they were running out of ideas for things monsters could do when this came out. What are you doing, playing Windstorm of Etiqua with it? I feel these knights were deliberately made worse than Armageddon Knight, both to make them all unique, and because Armageddon Knight made it a bit too easy to send a monster to the graveyard. But in doing so, it made these knights pack filler and mostly forgettable. In fact, when we were making our list of monsters we wanted to see retrained in 2023, I suggested Armageddon Knight when planning it, and then my co-host Sam asked, what about the other 5 knights? And I was like, wait, they're a series of monsters? So for years, I just thought this guy was an only child. Number 3, Book of Taiyu. Taiyu. I've always felt bad for Book of Taiyu because Konami sent it out to die. This is the counterpart of the famous Book of Moon, one of the most useful cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, still useful today. Book of Moon is a quick play spell that flips a face-up monster on the field face down. Simple as that. In the old game, this would usually lock a monster out of the battle phase for a turn, and give you a chance to hit over it if it has weak defense, since a monster's battle position can't be changed the turn it was summoned, and being a quick play spell, you could use it on your turn or your opponent's. And in the modern game, flipping your opponent's monsters face down can hinder them from using most of the extra deck summoning methods for a turn, and can stop them before they can activate certain effects. A big reason Book of Moon is not used as much today is because the effect is so useful that some monsters just have a Book of Moon effect built into their normal effects. But back in 2003, when the book was released in the set Pharaonic Guardian, they gave it a common card counterpart in that same set. Another book, the Book of Taiyu. Instead of flipping a monster face down, it flips a face down monster face up. It can mainly be used to flip your own monsters the turn they were set if they had flip effects, or if your opponent was playing defensively, you make their high defense low attack monster now be in attack mode. The main issue, it's not a quick play spell. You can only activate it on your own turn and not in response to anything. By not making it a quick play spell like Moon, it's much worse, and with flipping monsters face up not being very relevant anymore, it has even less staying power. I would ask why Konami didn't make it a quick play spell, but I think at the time they were afraid some of the flip effects would be too powerful if you could activate them on your opponent's turn at any point, as seen with other cards printed around that time that flip monsters on your opponent's turn that specifically say flip effects don't activate. I also think it's funny how they localized Book of Taiyu's name. You know what Taiyu means in English?
Hellfire, brushfire, bushfire, sun, more fire.
Why so many fire guesses?
It's hot.
Sun. It means sun. It's just the Book of Sun to go with how it's the opposite of Book of Moon, but for whatever reason, the localization team just kept the Japanese word for sun in its name, but not for Book of Moon. I don't know why, but it makes them seem slightly more different.
Oh, sure, switch it up. Keep me on my toes.
What's even more tragic about Book of Taiyu is if you mention Book of Moon has a counterpart, people will probably remember a counterpart, but they will likely think of the books that came out later based on Book of Moon's success. 2008 brought us Book of Eclipse, which is a quick play spell that flips all monsters on the field face down. The trade-off was, at the end of the turn, all monsters get flipped back up, and your opponent draws cards equal to the number of monsters flipped up. But you can avoid that if you vacate all the flipped monsters before the end of the turn. Then in 2021, we got one more counterpart with Book of Lunar Eclipse, which is a quick play spell where you discard a card, and then you can flip 2 monsters face down. I never really saw this used. I know it can be useful in decks that benefit from the discard, but I always found it funny how it was like, hey, you know what's stronger than 1 Book of Moon? 2 Books of Moon, also pay a cost. Also, shoutouts to Book of Life. It has nothing to do with flipping monsters and is specifically zombie support, so I've always considered it a cousin of the book cards that fits their aesthetic but doesn't really hang with them. Number 2, Ruin Queen of Oblivion. In 2006, we possibly got the best ritual monster at that time, Demise King of Armageddon. Ritual summon him with a relevant ritual spell, and he let you pay 2,000 life points to destroy all other cards on the field, and you can do it as many times as you want per turn if you need to. Being a full board wipe, it was part of a one-turn kill strategy around that time. Just get some ritual searchers in the deck, use advanced ritual art, summon Demise, board wipe your opponent, remember to use normal insect monsters for the ritual summon so you can banish them for a Doom Dozer, throw a Megamorph in there, and bada bing, you may have yourself 8,000 damage and your opponent will have nothing to defend themselves with. Being the namesake of an OTK makes you pretty well known, but because people just needed Demise, they never spoke about his other half released in the same set, Ruin Queen of Oblivion, the perfect parallels. Demise, Ruin, King, Queen, of, Armageddon, Oblivion. Together, they're supposed to represent the end of the world, but because Demise was doing such a good job on his own, people just talk about him of the ritual duo.
Ooh, pretty lady. Stomach out, thighs out.
That's actually not skin, it's just a skin tone color on her clothing.
Is that the English version or is that the real version?
No, it's the same in Japanese too. It's not like the clothing censorship we've seen from other monsters.
Oh, that's okay. It's her choice.
Ruin's effect is when she destroys a monster by battle, she can attack again. It's just a weaker Blackluster soldier envoy of the beginning with no banishing effect, so Demise being able to destroy everything including back row makes him leagues better, unless you have less than 2,000 life points, then who do you wish you had? Luckily for Ruin, every time Demise got a new form, she was included. They're a team after all. They made a mini Demise in Ruin, where Demise could destroy one card when summoned, and Ruin could attack up to 2 monsters during the battle phase. They also provided a little effect protection for ritual monsters after they were destroyed. These versions weren't very good, but it's lore. Then they got upgrades, where they were the Supreme King and Queen, with more attack points. Demise still destroys everything, and Ruin can still attack twice, though she needs to be summoned with only ritual monsters to get that effect, but without needing to destroy something first to get the second attack, which is nice. And they both dealt burn damage based on what they destroy. They also provide destruction protection for ritual monsters now. Demise protects against battle, and Ruin protects against card effects, so they have a lot going on, but I don't know any ritual decks that use them. Still, like with the mini forms, I appreciate them for the lore.
She's pretty, but I think I like the her of before better. Okay, now I want to put them in order. Who do I like? Small and medium, but I think large is last.
In the end, considering how many counterparts have gotten left behind when their more well-known halves have gotten retrains, it's nice to see every time Demise got something new, he took Ruin with him. For number 1, we chose a card that you probably don't know about, which is the point of this topic, but its original counterpart was part of an iconic group of monsters in the early game, and from then on, both of them received new forms to evolve their legacies in different directions. Number 1, Fairy Witch. This is a counterpart to Witch's Apprentice, who is a part of the Attribute Boosters, released in the second TCG set. These were monsters that each represented one of the 6 attributes in the game, and boosted the attack of monsters with attributes that matched them, while decreasing the attack of monsters with the opposite attribute. Light versus dark, fire versus water, earth versus wind, simple.
So you have the Chimera, which I guess makes sense, and then you have the weird star. What does Hoshiningen mean?
Well, his Japanese name is Superstar.
I love that, but I'm pretty sure he's stoned.
Does that mean you like him now?
No, I don't like it.
They were fun little guys to throw in your deck if you played a mostly mono-attribute deck. With them being somewhat iconic faces of the early game, it felt like they were all one of a kind. But remember how early Yu-Gi-Oh created new monster designs by palette swapping a lot of existing monsters? Well, it turns out Witch's Apprentice, the Dark Booster, was just a palette swap of Fairy Witch, a card that came out mere months before it in Japan. Fairy Witch was just an unremarkable normal monster, so nothing to truly note, but because Witch's Apprentice had an effect and a bunch of friends, and Fairy Witch was never even released internationally, Apprentice basically hogged all the spotlight with this design that Fairy Witch technically established first. And while the attribute boosters soon fell out of relevance, they got revitalized when they were retrained as Link monsters when those came out in 2017, where now they can be Link summoned for the same attribute boosts and debuffs, plus bonus effects when they're destroyed. Ever since, the Link attribute boosters have remained relevant in extra decks that could spare a bit of room, and Witch's Apprentice is better known now as Wii Witch's Apprentice.
Oh, adorable. I love her. I wish she had an actual archetype that wasn't mostly stupid. That's such a random group of characters. I do not understand what's happening.
Usually, this is where the story ends. One counterpart gets all the love, and the other one is left behind. But Fairy Witch instead branched out and away from her former counterpart. She got her own counterpart with blackjack and dragons. Enter the Memento archetype in 2023, 24 years after Fairy Witch premiered. This is an archetype based on old normal monsters, but now they're zombified bone versions of themselves. The ultimate goal of the deck is to get a bunch of them in the graveyard and then shuffle them back into the deck to summon their boss dragon. Some of them are based on well-known monsters like Darkblade or Trihorn Dragon, and others were less discussed like Key Mace, but the center of attention for the archetype was Ange Witch, the Memento retrain of Fairy Witch. It's cool that they did this for her, but I never quite figured out why. Now just tell tell the wind attribute booster that his forgotten counterpart needs a memento version too. Where's our mementoling cleaver? But thanks to this, it turned a footnote on the Witch's Apprentice biography into the most expensive card of another archetype, rising Fairy Witch to the best forgotten counterpart that may not be so forgotten anymore. Now, what did you think? Were all these counterparts lost in your memory too, or do they have greater sentimental value than we expected? And what are some of your favorite monster counterparts that no one really brings up, whether we discussed them or not? Let us know in the comments. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and we will see you in the next video.